One of my favorite parts of my whole PhD was the final writing process. And unlike a lot of students, I actually really enjoyed it. So in this video, I'm going to share some of the things that I did differently. So first of all, I decided before I started writing not to invest any energy into worrying about what the examiners thought of my work or whether I would pass or fail the defense. This isn't to say that I wouldn't have been affected had I failed, but worrying about it in advance wouldn't have helped in any way. I also decided to focus on the areas where I was strongest and what I found most interesting. So I'd spent a lot of time, especially early in my PhD, worrying about the gaps in my knowledge. But focusing on what I was good at made it a lot easier to write, easier to defend, and I think also more interesting for the examiners because I wrote about things that I had a point of view on. So while I tried not to worry about what the examiners would think, I still put care into the work. I didn't just get words down on the page or try to write a shitty first draft as so many people advise. I took my time to think about what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. But whenever I mention this, people always raise the issue of perfectionism. And what they call perfectionism is really often actually indecision stemming from a lack of confidence. And writing as fast as you can doesn't really solve that problem. If you want to write well, you need to put some care into it. And if you want to make an intelligent academic argument, you need to give it some thought. If you overthink and doubt and second guess everything, then it's a problem. But this is why you need to make confident decisions and move forwards. And to help me do this, I set myself the target of writing a minimum of 500 words per day. And for me, that was a relatively easy target that I could beat almost every day. Sometimes I could write 500 words in about an hour. Other times it would take all day, depending on what I was writing about. Some things are just more difficult to write about than others, so they take a bit longer. So setting this target allowed for a bit of variation in pace. It allowed me to slow down and think when I needed to, while also making sure that I made decisions and moved forwards. So for me, 500 was an achievable target, but I was writing in my native language and I was able to work on it full time. So set a target that you can beat. That might be a minimum of, say, 150 words, but it will add up if you do it consistently. Now, having this objective measure of success meant that if I smashed my target, I felt great, and if it took all day to reach 500 words, I could still feel good about overcoming the difficulty. So this meant that I finished pretty much every day feeling good about my progress. And to reinforce that good feeling, I also created a grid to stick on the wall next to the computer, with each block on the grid representing 500 words, each row of 4 blocks representing 2,000 words, 5 rows representing 10,000, and the whole sheet representing 20,000. So as I increased the word count, coloring in the blocks gave me a way of visualizing and celebrating and reinforcing my progress. It's a small thing, but it just felt really good to do. And part of the reason for setting these word count targets was to help maintain consistency from one day to the next. So while there was some variability, I was at least getting the minimum done every day, and my average per day was higher. Another way I tried to ensure consistency was by stopping each day while I still had energy in reserve. So some students, when they feel they're in the flow, force themselves to keep going late into the night for fear that they won't be able to recapture that same creative energy the next day. But that approach of working to exhaustion guarantees that they won't have energy the next day. So by stopping with something in reserve, I could switch off and let my brain relax and process, and as a result, I was able to start the next day well rested. Another slightly unusual aspect of my approach was that I started with the introduction and worked in sequence through the document, instead of starting somewhere in the middle or working on several sections at the same time and then jumping between them. So the metaphor that I use to describe this is that it's like digging a tunnel through a mountain. You can't start in the middle. You have to start at the beginning, and as you progress, you can only dig at the rock face in front of you. This meant that I never had to decide what to work on. I always had a clear point of focus, which in some ways made things much simpler because I didn't have to make that decision. But it also meant that whenever I hit a problem, something I wasn't sure about or something that was difficult to explain, I had to slow down, face the problem, and find a solution. But what a lot of people will do is just switch to writing about something else. And while that does help you increase the word count, at least in the short term, it removes any possibility that you solve the problems that arise. And eventually, you will run out of easy things to write about, and all you're left with will be the difficult problems that you ran away from, which you then have to face all at the same time when you're probably under the most time pressure. And to make it more difficult, instead of learning how to solve problems in your writing, you will have trained the habit of avoiding problems. And habits that you establish are very hard to break when you're under great stress. But if you face problems as they arise, if you slow down and deal with them, that's where you develop your skill and confidence as a writer, and that's where you can start to enjoy the challenge. Related to this last point, another unusual thing I did was to try to finish each section to a submittable standard before moving on to the next. And this meant reading through it, editing it, and wherever possible, taking care of any references or formatting or any other details or decisions that needed to be made, rather than leaving them for later. So I'll often speak to students who have written a lot, maybe 100,000 words or more, but nothing is actually finished. Not one section actually looks submittable because it's not properly formatted. There are loads of missing references and incomplete sections and notes to self. And the more you write this way, the more mess you create. So it's not surprising if you feel like you're working and working but not getting any closer to the finish line. And again, you're training the habit of not finishing what you're working on, and then you have to try and tidy up everything at the end at the same time. Guaranteed stress. But if you tidy up as you go, finishing the sections you work on to a submittable standard, or as close to a submittable standard as possible, then you'll probably have a lot more confidence that you can finish the whole thesis, and you'll be able to look back on the sections that you've with pride. And speaking of finishing, that's where I'm going to finish this video. Now I know that some of you will be thinking, yeah, but I can't write this way because. If so, please leave a comment below and I might be able to help. I can't guarantee that you will enjoy writing, but if we can reduce the suffering, then it's definitely worth it. Also, please leave a comment if you enjoy writing and let me know how you approach it. Is there anything that you do that's a little bit different? So that's all from me. Thank you so much for watching and happy writing.